Fighting against injustice across Connecticut, Melissa in the Morning checks in with the Commission on Human Rights and Opportunities on WICC 600.
Well, we are just 1 week out from Halloween, and joining us this morning is Jody Walker-Smith. Good morning, Jody. How are you?
Good morning, Melissa. I'm doing well, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing fine. Always love having you on the show, Jody. And I know today we're talking about non-discriminatory costumes. What would you say are some of the more common discriminatory costumes we've seen in recent years? Maybe not just here in Connecticut, but just like in the news nationally, would have been some of the costumes out there.
Yes. So I think the most obvious, hopefully, to folks, but, there always seems to be someone who might not have heard the news that darkening your skin is really never okay. It harkens back to blackface. And I think that sometimes folks don't think about the history that comes with that and really just are not aware of how much harm that causes. And so, if there was one takeaway about discriminatory costumes or really any time of the year, it is never darken skin color.
Jody,
and it's an important thing to teach kids, too.
I was just going to say, do you mind actually just taking a few minutes here to talk about blackface? Because I do think, we saw even prominent people like Justin Trudeau in Canada, who there was a photograph. And of course, I'm sure this was a political ploy, was to bring up a photo of him from his college days. But,
Sure.
Even somebody like that, who I find to be an amazing leader, somebody who's very intelligent, did the same thing that you're talking about. And I know we're in a very, I want to say, a corrective time in our history right now. So maybe it wasn't something that was pointed out to him when that happened years and years ago. But for people who don't understand why it's inappropriate, even if you're doing a school play, like you said, we're talking about Halloween, but in general, this is inappropriate to do at any time. Could you explain some of the history and why that is?
Sure. I mean, I will preface it by saying, I'm not an expert, but I done some research, and I like to learn, and then once I know better, do better. And so I have learned that blackface is really harkens back to a time where there were these minstrel shows, these shows that white people would put on and darken their face and then act in a way that was derogatory and extremely offensive about Black people for entertainment. And so it was really a caricature of a Black person in what was deemed to be theater.
Okay. Yeah, I know, actually, it's interesting that you bring this up because I had this conversation a couple of weeks ago with somebody, and the what we were talking about, but one of the characters that they wanted to play or they wanted to dress up as, I should say, is African American, and I had said, like kind of in passing, I had kind of said, like, yeah, you should be that character, just like certainly don't like put makeup on, and they exactly. they kind of looked at me like I was crazy, like why. And I was like, well, what do you mean why? Like, what are you talking about? Like, it's pretty obvious why. And so you'd be surprised that even though people hear about it and they're like, okay, but I'm doing this, I'm not doing this to make fun of anybody. If anything, like this person was like, I'm idolizing this person. I want to be this person. And I'm like, well, that's great, but you literally cannot paint your face, like you can't do it. So that's why I wanted to take just a minute to just explain why even if you are idolizing someone and you want to dress like that person, to go to the extent of painting your face is not going to be seen as a compliment. It is just not going to be seen that way.
Absolutely. And I think what's so important about what you're saying, Melissa, is that we have to remember that we don't do anything in a vacuum. I mean, the whole point of wearing a costume is so other people will perceive us a certain way, right? We're not wearing a costume just to sit at home and look in the mirror. So the point of wearing a costume is how other people are going to perceive us. And if someone is trying to idolize someone and doesn't know the history and doesn't realize how harmful it is and darkens their skin for their costume, they're still harming the people who are perceiving them, whether they meant to or not. And so I mean, we can't expect everyone to know everything, of course, but we do all have some responsibility for learning and understanding history and learning that there's context behind things. And it's not just about our intent.
Yeah, and taking the time to educate yourselves, which
Right.
I think is really great. That's why I love having the commission on every week. We're chatting with the Commission on Human Rights and Opportunities. Jody Walker-Smith is here, and we're talking about Halloween costumes and making sure that we're not discriminating. So we were talking, obviously, about blackface, which I think many people are very familiar with. And in a second, Jody, I'm going to ask you if and when I should say, I know if, when parents should be talking about this with their kids and how do they explain it. But before we get to that, what are some other costumes that people should really just be avoiding at all costs for understandable reasons?
I think it's helpful to think about what is the actual costume. Is this a real character from a book or a movie, or is the costume someone's identity? So oftentimes costumes, especially mass-produced costumes, but can show up anywhere, turn a person's identity into a stereotyped image. So you can imagine if someone is dressing up as a geisha, for instance, and they don't come from that cultural background, they're turning nuanced cultural item and clothing and history into a stereotyped image. Another one you might see in those big box stores is a Mexican, quote unquote, wearing a caricature kind of outfit with a sombrero and maybe a mustache. You might see Dia de los Muertos costumes that might remind you of that Disney movie Coco, but there's obviously a lot more context culturally and historically to that holiday in that culture. Let's see, Native American costumes, when someone is just dressed up as a Native American and they are not from an indigenous community. So those are just some kind of broad examples.
So, Jody, this could be very complicated, and you just kind of hinted at a question that I had. So, like, Dia de los Muertos, you're absolutely right. I can tell you, as a Disney fan myself, that my son at one point was like, maybe I'd love to be Miguel from Coco. You see little girls dress up like Pocahontas, or maybe like Tiger Lily from Peter Pan. These are costumes that are also being offered at stores. So it's
Right.
really challenging when you're trying to teach your children, hey, this is kind of inappropriate because my kids aren't Native American. So like how do you have that conversation, especially when they're seeing not only other children dressed that way, but when you're going into very popular Halloween stores and these are being offered to children.
Right. Yeah, I think it's a great question, and it's a hard question. Mm-hmm. There's certainly not one right answer, and I'm not a parenting expert either, but I think I kind of try to start with the most broad, simple thing that I can start with my kids. My kids are 5 and 7, and so I would talk about, when you go into those box stores, you'll also see like a costume of an Arab person that looks menacing with a very stereotypical dress, the clothing. And so we can kind of point to things that are a little more obvious to try to make the initial point and talk about how when you turn someone's identity into a costume, but that's that person's real identity, and that's not what they look like, right? And so you kind of try to lead them to understanding that, okay, well, if I want to dress up as, someone who's Native American, what am I doing? What do I know about Native Americans? And how do I think Native Americans would feel about me just dressing up as one of them? Which is a little different than, as you're saying, a particular character.
I see what you're saying.
Idea,
like a generic versus a character. I see what you're saying. Yep.
Yeah,
I see what you're saying.
And there very well might be people who will also potentially be uncomfortable or feel some offense to, for instance, a white child dressing up as Pocahontas. And everyone has the right to have their feelings and their comfort level about that. There's some discrepancy about whether a particular character costume fits into this idea of cultural appropriation. But I think we need to just understand that there's not going to be one right answer. There isn't a checklist we can follow. We just have to ask ourselves these questions. Like, is this costume based on race, ethnicity, religion, or culture? Because you also see, costumes of nuns or different religious costumes can be offensive and potentially discriminatory as well. Or does this costume exploit a symbol of another culture that I haven't researched and I don't know enough about? So if your child comes to you and says, I want to be, XYZ, you could say, well, let's learn a little bit more about that. Maybe they'll be really interested in learning about the history and culture, and you can have it be a learning opportunity. Or you can just have it be a learning opportunity about how some people in this society don't always get treated the same way as other people. And so when you are someone who has social identities that mean that you're treated a little better, putting on a costume for a day of someone who very likely is not treated as well in our society, and then being able to take it off afterwards doesn't feel very good for the people who are of that social identity. And so that can be a way to kind of explain it to young children.
Yeah, that's a good point. Jody Walker-Smith, I really appreciate you coming on, talking about this, especially when we're a week out from Halloween. I thank you so much, and I look forward to chatting with you again in the future.
Thanks so much, Melissa.
All right, we'll talk again soon. That's the Commission on Human Rights and Opportunities right here on WICC.